So this is lecture number 4. This is covering the material from chapter 13 to 15 of the Manias, Panics, and Crashes book. So let's start. Okay, so for the overview of these 3 chapters, really, as you're reading it, the bulk of your time is really going to be spent on chapter 13. It's certainly the denser part. But in my personal opinion, chapter 14 was perhaps the most interesting. Now, chapter 13 is basically a 1 chapter attempt at trying to understand what the 2008 financial crisis was, what caused it, and how it was related to Lehman Brothers and the run on that investment bank. That's going to be the bulk of what we talk about in this lecture. Chapter 14 is basically, what have we learned in the 12 chapters that preceded chapter 13, in chapters 1 through 12? What did that history that was outlined for us in chapter 1 through 12, what did that tell us about the possibility of financial crises in the future? And then chapter 15 is, in my case, with the addition of the book that I have, which was written right around 2010, what does that 10 years look like? Fortunately, it is already 2020, so we can actually have a pretty good idea about talking about it from the perspective of knowing what that 10-year period history looked like and how accurate the authors were. Now, I conclude on this slide that really one of the key things from these 3 chapters, and really a key theme of this book, as now the book is kind of wrapping up here, is that even though asset prices decline, you don't have to have a crisis. But mismanaging that decline in the asset prices can lead to a run, or everyone kind of crowding into cashing out of that investment. And that pandemonium, basically, to cash out in those assets can cause a financial crisis or a mania. So, to really understand the financial crisis, it's helpful to know what was the innovation that was made that made this all different. Why was there a housing crisis specifically in 2008 when there wasn't one before? And really the key thing that changed, the innovation, quote unquote, the innovation in the financial industry was going from collateralized mortgage obligations to collateralized debt obligations. So let's talk about what those are. So previous to the 1970s, a person would go to a bank for a mortgage. The person would apply for that mortgage and they would be interviewed quite extensively. And it was hit or miss whether you were going to be approved for that mortgage. And the only way you were going to get that mortgage is if you had an account at that bank for a long time. It wasn't just your credit score. Like, they basically had to know who you are, what your job was, that you had good character references, and you pretty much could not have declared bankruptcy ever or any of those kinds of things. And the reason why it was so strict was because a lot of banks actually held on to the mortgages. They didn't sell them to anyone else. It was on their books for the 30 years it was going to take you to pay it off. So they obviously were very concerned. Every time someone defaulted on their mortgage, that hurt them, the bank, personally. Now, there are government organizations that existed at the time even to take mortgages off the books of the bank so that the bank could lend money for other purposes. That would be Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac do is that they're government organizations that will buy the loans from the bank so that the bank can lend money out to other people. But instead of selling all these little individual mortgages, there was an innovation in the 1970s called the Collateralized mortgage obligation. And what they basically did is they ranked a person's kind kind of credit score. The closest equivalent would be grouped mortgage borrowers by their credit score and how likely they were to pay. And they put all those people in each kind of credit range into the same bucket, right? So everyone who had a perfect 800 credit score and had never defaulted and never declared bankruptcy would all be those, like, let's say 100 applicants. Those 100 mortgages would be in a single really, really big bond that could be given to Fannie Mae and sold to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac or sold to other investors. And then, like, let's say everyone that had like a few missed payments, but like a score of 700, a pretty good score, but not a fantastic score, they might be in a different bucket. And then people who have like a 500 credit score, who have like no bankruptcies, but just weren't always good about paying things off, and they were lucky enough to get a mortgage, well, then they would be put in another group. And the idea was that you, as an investor or someone buying that bond, all those mortgages, you would know what you're getting into. You're not taking that much risk with the 800 credit score person, so you're not going to get a really huge rate of return because you're basically guaranteed that you're going to get paid back. But on the other hand, someone with a really low credit score, somewhere in the 500s, it's going to be hit or miss. Some of those are not going to probably pay off. Some of those people are going to go bankrupt, and some are actually going to pay it off. So you actually have to offer there's going to be a higher rate of interest associated with it because it's hit or miss, whether you're going to get the money or not. So that was what existed up until 2000, the Collateralized Mortgage Obligation, CMO. And it was pretty clear for investors what risk they were getting into because the bucket was homogeneous, had the same identity. It was good credit score, bad credit score, medium credit score. And what happened then in the new century, in the year 2000, was that all of those separate buckets, those tranches, were merged together. The buckets, the word that's used that people in finance use is a tranche. A tranche is a French word. All those tranches were combined with each other. And what was done as a sort of innovation was to put all those tranches into the same financial instrument, but change the order in which people get paid off. So within the same instrument, you could say, these people get paid off first, these people get paid off second, these people get paid off third. So to the extent that people aren't paying their mortgage obligations, it's probably not going to affect the first tranche, but it might affect the second or the third or the fourth, depending on how many people actually pay off the bond. But what was the third bullet point on this is especially important. But what was very curious and very bad, and was basically the fatal flaw that caused all the problems. The fatal flaw was that each bond has to get a credit rating. So, for instance, just as an example here, the Honolulu Board of Water Supply, City County Board of Water Supply, they are issuing a bond next week, and that bond is issued using the credit rating of the city and county. Now, the city and county has borrowed a lot of money to build the rail, so their credit score is not fantastic, but it's not bad either. They've not missed anything, but they've obviously taken on a lot of debt. So their credit rating is AA. That means it's investment grade. It's not likely, or it's not even it's possible, but it's not probable that Honolulu would not pay back that investment. So that AA rating is kind of like a credit score for the bond. And as a third bullet point points out here, is that for some weird reason, some odd reason, the tranches of the CDOs who got paid first, second, third, fourth, fifth, were all stated to be equally risky. And that the CDO as a whole was less risky than a CMO. And the reason why they said that was because of data from the investment bank. Now, this is wrong. We know it in retrospect that it's wrong. Now, for any of you who have watched, and maybe by the end of the semester to do the last few chapters, if you've seen The Big Short, the scene in the movie where this is applying to is the one where, remember that one guy is like building that Jenga tower and like taking out like certain like, I don't know what you call those things, those pieces of wood, right? And he's taking out those pieces. Basically, that's taking out tranches, right? And he's basically saying, okay, well, if enough of these fail, the whole thing goes down. And that's basically what he's saying here, is that there's no reason why you would think that all of the tranches are equally risky, because essentially you've got the lowest rated ones, which are more likely than not that are going to fail. But if enough of the tranches fail, then the entire debt instrument fails, which is the collapse of the housing market. But investors, investment banks, and investors in general really liked these CDOs. They really, really liked them. And they liked the high credit score, high credit rating they got. And they liked the high interest rate that they got. And they got a high interest rate for those CDOs because they had some pretty risky assets in them. Yet they were investment grade, meaning AA, single A rated. With all this money out there that was able to be lent out, you had to find enough people who needed a mortgage. And there's only so many people out there who need a mortgage at any time, right? I mean, you have to be kind of a certain age and have a certain amount of assets where you would need or you would want a mortgage. So you basically have to expand the pool. The way that you expand the pool is that you say to someone who's always rented and has missed a few payments, like, you can qualify for a mortgage. We'll give you an adjustable rate mortgage that makes things cheap because the interest rate is really low. Or you only have to pay interest for the first 4 years or 5 years. And then only then do you have to pay, make principal payments, what's called a kind of a balloon sort of payment. Or you offer a low rate for a promotional time period, and then you then say after a while we'll raise the rate. And people did this. People bought this because either they needed a place to live, they were told that it was cheaper than renting. Like, don't be a sucker, just stop renting and giving your landlord money. You own something. And for things like the teaser rate or the interest-only payment, you would basically just say, well, you're not going to live in the house that long anyway. You're probably going to flip it, and so you're not even going to be owning it. So why do you care what the interest rate's going to be 5 years from now? You're going to be long gone. You're going to be in a bigger house that you made from the rising property value. And people, I don't want to say fell for it, but people did it. People thought that it was a reflection of, they must be able to afford the mortgage if they qualified for it, right? Because again, remember what I was saying, what happened in the 1950s, 1960s, that mortgage approval process was quite rigorous. So it was in fact true. If you qualified in the 1950s, you had to have been pretty darn good credit risk. Like, you were a good, you could afford that mortgage. But that same criteria did not exist in the 2000s. Now, because the volume of mortgages had increased so much, investment banks, as they're moving the mortgages through the process of mortgage broker to investment bank to investors to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, that pipeline, all the loans in that pipeline is growing longer and longer, as long as 6 months. And so the consequence of that is that if something bad happens, banks, investment banks, are going to need 6 months to get everything out of their book. So they have an incentive to basically hide things as long as they can, so that if they know there's a problem, they're not going to tell anyone for as long as they can, at least up to 6 months, because then the problem is out of their hands. And unfortunately, in this situation, the investment banks know more about the mortgage debt than the others do. And since they kind of sort of control the mortgage brokers, you're just getting more fraud. And that's what I mean by the third to last bullet point. You're seeing more fraud in the mortgage origination process. People lying about their name, or lying about their income, or lying about their job. You see that all in the origination process. And the brokers don't care, because they're just sales agents. They're just trying to get you to sign up for the mortgage so they can get their commission. They're not going to hold on to the loan. They're getting it to the bank, or the mortgage bank, or the investment bank. And no one really thought that all the prices were going to fall nationally, because it had never happened in the United States that all the prices had fallen in the entire country. That there might be real estate bubbles, but they were regional, not national. And even if you could say that they were going to fall, even regionally, they weren't going to fall by very much. At least that was the expectation. So we know that most of those things, if you have a basic understanding of the financial crisis, we know that most of those things were not true. We know that there was a financial crisis, which we saw where housing prices reached their peak in 2006. And so one of the first things we could say here was that when the crisis actually manifested itself, the obvious first losers in that situation were the people who bought their home at the peak, because they were very quickly underwater. And you may have heard that term before. To be underwater means that you owe more on the house than what it's worth. Now, the other people, though, that it start to then get hurt by the financial crisis are the brokers, because the brokers are pushing these things through as quickly and as they can. But one of the problems is that there were clauses that said that if a broker sold a loan and the loan went bad, let's say in 6 months or a year, then the broker had to take it back. The brokers didn't think that was going to happen very much, and it did. And obviously, a lot of mortgage brokers didn't have the money for that kind of thing, so many of them, most of them, went bankrupt. And then you had investment banks that were failing, like Lehman Brothers, that we'll be talking about here. Well, Lehman Brothers being the largest investment bank. You had many, many, many commercial banks failing. Bear Stearns essentially failed and was acquired by J.P. Morgan Chase. Countrywide Financial, which originated mortgages, failed. And Washington Mutual, largest bank in the United States to have ever failed. I even lost money at that bank. I had a checking account there, and even I lost money at that. Let's just look at this here, just so that we can see this here. So if you're curious about this kind of thing, and we're going to talk about it pretty quickly soon here, let's just look at the FDIC. So the FDIC, it is the agency that insures it insures deposits. And we can actually just look quite quickly here what banks have failed. So let's look at it. And let's do it. Oh, look at that. Some banks are failing even here. Not too long ago here. Just in case you're curious here, last one to fail in Hawaii, I think, was on the North Shore. Back in like 2015, if I'm not mistaken. If you're curious about this kind of thing, Kirk Caldwell's wife used to run the FDIC. She used to be the chairwoman of the FDIC back in the early 2000s when no banks were failing. So it wasn't like she wasn't in the thick of it. Dude, I don't even know what this bank is. Bank of Honolulu. It was acquired by Bank of the Orient. I don't even think. So it was basically a bank that was shut down during a recession that was in the United States at around this time, 2000, 2001. And it was acquired by a San Francisco bank. I don't even know if they have Bank of the Orient. I want to say it might be actually. I wanted to say they might actually still have an office in Chinatown, I thought. Sorry, this is like way off base here of what of the lecture here, but I thought, or maybe they don't. Oh no, they do. Yeah, I was right. Yeah, so they still have their, they still have the office that would have been Honolulu Bank. They have that at Bishop Street. Okay, let's go back to the lecture. Okay, so now this one's going to be pretty long here. I'm going to spend most of my time in this lecture talking about Chapter 13. So one of the key things and most important things to really talk about with the 2008 financial crisis is the failure of Lehman Brothers. And the reason why that is so important is because Lehman Brothers was one of the 4 largest investment banks. And investment banks are important because they are basically the institutions that ensure that credit flows in the economy. And the reason why that's important is because without credit, the economy crumbles when there's a liquidity crisis. So these investment banks are critical to ensuring that money flows. And basically, Lehman Brothers was an investment bank that had taken on a great deal of risk with the housing crisis. And obviously that bet went bad. And that was part of the crisis. So there's going to be a lot of YouTube videos I'm going to show you in this lecture, but that's only because this is obviously a pretty recent event, the 2008 financial crisis. So let's just start with this first one here.
Brothers is going bankrupt in financial.
So this is from Al Jazeera. Again, keep in mind, funded in whole or in part by the Qatari government. I'm sure. We can all say what we want about biases in the news, but Al Jazeera is a pretty, it has biases, just like any news, just like most news, not all news. BBC and NPR are pretty even-handed, even though you might not think it is. Oh, actually, I'm really sorry here. I'm not trying to deviate here, but let me just show you this clip here. This is that clip I was referring to where the tranches are taken out, just because I think this might make it even clearer my tranche discussion, which some of you might have thought was not even important. They're swearing, I think.
Okay, hi. How are you?
Have a seat.
Okay, Mr. Bennett from Deutsche Bank. Here we have.
There you go.
So just to make this clear here, on the one side, you've got an investment bank, or at least an agent of the investment bank, and on the other one you have a hedge fund. You have investors that are investing money in what the investment bank is selling. The investment bank would buy these mortgages, and then it wants to sell the mortgages to investors. And Steve Carell and the others, those are the investors. And that other guy, I don't know who he is, but he's a pretty famous actor. He's representing the investment bank.
So how many people have you talked to about this trade?
That's the investment
A
bank.
few. There's definitely some interest.
Oh, my boss would have my ass.
You crazy, Jim?
Get lost,
Fuck
you.
Which is why you're here talking to us. Wrong number. Sounds like there's a lot of interest.
All right. A few people have invited us in just to laugh at me on this deal. Is that you?
No.
Is that what this is?
That's not what this is. That's just how Mark is. Let's see what you got.
I'm sorry. You smell that? What is that?
What?
What's that smell?
Your cologne?
No.
Opportunity.
No. Money.
Okay.
I smell money.
Okay.
Chris. God damn it. Sorry.
And there we go. There's our tranches. So this is the tranches. So again, this entire Jenga tower is the investment. The entire bond that's being sold, the investment bond that's being sold. And the individual, I don't know what you call those things, those little stick things, those are the credit ratings on certain tranches. So you see AAA, that would be the best. Triple B, that would be bad stuff.
This is your basic mortgage bond. All right? The originals were simple. They were just thousands of AAA mortgages bundled together, guaranteed by the U.S. government.
There you go. Okay. Absolutely what he's saying is correct, right? That's our collateralized mortgage obligation, CMO. What he just said. Thousands of AA, AAA mortgages all in the same thing. So you knew what you were getting.
The modern ones are different. They're private, and they're made up of layers of tranches.
There you go. Well, look, hey, look at that. It's exactly what I said. Let's just do this.
The highest level AAA is getting paid first. The lowest rated B is getting paid last, taking on defaults first. Now, obviously, if you're buying Bs, you can make more money, but they're a little risky. Sometimes they fail. Chris? Somewhere along the line, these Bs and double Bs went from a little risky to dog shit. Where's the trash?
Behind you.
I'm talking rock bottom FICO scores. No income verification. Adjustable rates, dog shit. The default rates are already up from 1% to 4%, fellas. And if they rise to 8%, and they will, a lot of these triple Bs are going to 0 too. And that, you're too close, is an opportunity.
Okay, you're saying that at 8% the bonds fail, and we are already at 4%?
That's right.
If they go to 8, it's Armageddon.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so again, what Jared Bennett in this case is saying is that the Bs are already failing at the rate of 4%. As more of those Bs fail, then that's going to start to affect the triple Bs, which are a little bit better than Bs. And as these, it's kind of cascading. So then Bs are failing, triple Bs fail, then A's fail, then AA and AAA's fail. So all the tranches start collapsing and the entire bond becomes worthless.
How come nobody's talking about this?
You're completely sure of the math. Look at him. That's my quant.
You're what?
My quantitative. My math specialist. Look at him. You notice anything different about him? Look at his face.
That's pretty racist.
Look at his eyes. I'll give you a hint. His name's Yang. He won a national math competition in China. He doesn't even speak English. Yeah, I'm sure of the math. Actually, my name's Jiang, and I do speak English. Jared likes to say I don't because he thinks it makes me seem more authentic. And I got second in that national math competition.
So you're offering us a chance to short this pile of blocks? How?
With something called a credit default swap. It's like insurance on the bond, and if it goes bust, you can make 10 to 1, even 20 to 1 return.
So that's in essence what if you've already seen this movie, that's exactly why it's called The Big Short. Because basically you could say, yeah, I can see with this Jenga metaphor, I can see that it's going to fail. So I could basically short it and say, I bet you the housing market's going to fail. And you could take that bet on by buying a credit default swap, which would be basically insuring you against losses in the housing market by owning that debt.
And it's already slowly going bust.
10 to 1, 20 to 1. No way.
And no one's paying attention. No one is paying attention because the banks are too busy getting paid obscene fees to sell these bonds.
But wait, you are the bank. When you work for the bank, I bet your margins are pretty nice and fat.
Let's not talk about my margins, by the way. Being nice and fat, that's a nice shirt. Do they make it for men?
Aren't you the bank?
I work for the bank. I don't think like a bank. Big bank, small bank, I like to make money. All right? Let me put it this way. I'm standing in front of a burning house, and I'm offering you fire insurance on it.
How can these underlying bonds be as bad as you say? It wouldn't be legal.
Nobody knows what's in them. Nobody knows what's in the bonds. I've seen some that are 65% AAA rated, that I know for a fact are filled with 95% subprime shit with FICOs below 550.
Get the fuck out of here.
You want me to really blow your mind? When the market deems a bond too risky to buy, what do you think we do with it? Take a guess.
I don't know, you tell me.
All right. You think we just warehouse it on the books? No. We just repackage it with a bunch of other shit that didn't sell and put it into a CDO.
A CDO.
Yes, a CDO.
What is that?
This is where we take a bunch of Bs, double Bs, and triple Bs that haven't sold, and we put them in a pile. And when the pile gets large enough, the whole thing is suddenly considered diversified. And then the whores at the rating agency give it a 92, 93% AAA rating. No questions asked.
And that's, again, the innovation that comes after 2000, where you put those tranches in the order of payment. And they basically, those CDOs contain the riskiest things, yet they were rated pretty high.
Say that again.
A collateralized debt obligation. It's important to understand because it's what allowed a housing crisis to become a nationwide economic disaster.
Dude, I would totally agree with what he just said. And that's also kind of the point of Chapter 13.
Here's world-famous chef Anthony Bourdain to explain.
Okay, I'm a chef on a Sunday afternoon, setting the menu at a big restaurant. I ordered my fish on Friday, which is the mortgage bond that Michael Burry shorted. But some of the fresh fish doesn't sell. I don't know why. Maybe it just came out. Halibut has the intelligence of a dolphin. So
this would be that really badly rated mortgages are not selling. That no one wants to buy a person's mortgage that has a 500 credit score and a few bankruptcies, because you basically know he or she is not going to pay it. So no one wants to buy it.
what am I going to do? Throw all this unsold fish, which is the triple B level of the bond, in the garbage and take the loss? No way. Being the crafty and morally onerous chef that I am, whatever crappy levels of the bond I don't sell, I throw into a seafood stew. See, it's not old fish. It's a whole new thing. And the best part is they're eating 3-day-old halibut. That is a CDO.
Well, I just need to know how these could possibly be collated.
So somehow you're like the Dora the Explorer, and you're the first person who has found this thing.
Hold on. So mortgage bonds are dog shit. CDOs are dog shit wrapped in cat shit.
Yeah, that's right. Institutions treat these CDOs like they're as solid as treasury bonds, and they're going to zero.
No, it can't be right. There were $500 billion in housing bonds sold last year alone. The ratings agencies, the banks, the fucking government. You're saying they're all asleep at the wheel?
Yeah. My whole department's long on this stuff. They call me Chicken Little. They call me Bubble Boy. A's, 0. B's, 0. Double B's, 0. Triple B's, 0. And then that happens.
What is that?
That's America's housing market. Thank you.
Fucking A, Jared.
Shut your fucking mouth. Hang out with you.
Good. Okay.
Stack up, do the deal. Let's be friends.
Thank you.
No bullshit.
All right.
You're gonna say no, aren't you?
No, I'm just evaluating right now. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Bye, Jared.
I don't like it. He's playing us. He's playing us. He's got too much skin in the game, and he's dumping his position.
What if he's right?
You want him to be right.
Yes, I do. The banks have given us 25% interest rates on credit cards. They have screwed us on student loans that we can never get out from under. Then this guy walks into my office and says, those same banks got greedy, they lost track of the market, and I can profit off of their stupidity. Fuck, yeah, I want him to be right.
I mean,
How come you don't hate this guy? He's everything you taught us not to trust.
I can't hate him. He is so transparent in his self-interest that I kind of respect him. Would I buy a car from him? No. Is he right about the mortgage market? Let's find out. Let's find out. Look, it's two very simple questions. Is there a housing bubble? And if there is, how exposed are the banks?
Okay.
Let's get on this quickly, too, because if he's right, every loser with a couple $1,000,000 in a fund is going to be jumping on this.
And so that helps you kind of understand that scene, hopefully. Sorry, I was also trying to show you this, which was Lehman Brothers going bankrupt. But again, hopefully that 8-minute side point there helps you understand a little bit more about the tranches and the shift from CMOs to CDOs.
And financial markets from Asia to Europe are doing their utmost to prevent Monday from turning from dark to black.
So this video, the news from September 15th, what had happened at this point, what we're going to talk about in the slides here is that Lehman declared bankruptcy, but now we did not know whether it was going to, how it was going to dissolve itself. Was it going to be a messy bankruptcy or an organized bankruptcy? And the problem with this is that if the investment bank Lehman Brothers fails in a bad way, in a disorganized way, it would threaten to take down the entire world economy. And this short little 2-minute piece here is basically being produced at the point where we know Lehman has declared bankruptcy, but we don't know if it'll be clean or not.
Employees of America's fourth largest investment bank saw the writing on the wall late Sunday after talks to pull them back from the abyss collapsed. British firm Barclays Bank.
And so what we're going to see here in the slide here, but what's being said here is that the government decided not to bail out Lehman Brothers. They allowed Lehman Brothers to fail. No other bank stepped up to make this bankruptcy be any cleaner.
Bank said no thanks, while Bank of America decided instead to help another struggling bank, Merrill Lynch, in a merger deal worth over $50 billion. The U.S. government said it won't bail out Lehman, which last week announced more than $3.9 billion in losses. Shares in Lehman Brothers have plummeted more than 80% in 2008 alone.
Lehman, like so many other investment banks and banks, really got, quite frankly, caught up in the housing bubble. But like every bubble, the bubble ended, and now we're seeing the downside of that bubble.
Following the same risky practices that sunk former giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, Lehman also had a hand in securing America's high-risk subprime mortgages, believing that the popularity and sheer volume of those loans would net huge gains. But it didn't. Borrowers saturated the U.S. housing market, taking on enormous mortgages in spite of poor credit history. As the economy cooled, Americans found themselves with less cash to spend. Higher fuel prices did not help. The result was that more Americans began missing their monthly mortgage payments. As Lehman Brothers secured many of those mortgages, the result was more than $60 billion in losses. Lehman Brothers now go to court, where a judge will take control of the bank until its assets are sold. The implications could be profound.
Everybody in the West, at least, owns, a lot of people have got pensions, and these pensions invest in stock market, and a lot of the shares are actually the shares of banks. And when bank shares get hammered, people's pensions get hammered, so everybody loses. When big banks like Lehman go under, the housing market is going to suffer again. House prices are going to fall in America, in Britain, in Europe, and so on. That's going to again hit millions of ordinary people.
Meanwhile, as markets everywhere react, the bottom to America's financial woes appear nowhere in sight. 10 of the world's biggest banks have set up a $70 billion emergency fund to help stabilize the market, and they may need it. Reports that American insurance giant AIG is also seeking a U.S. government bailout will only compound Lehman's fallout.
So at this point, too, when this video was made here, we didn't know yet what was going to happen to AIG, which we're going to see here as we're watching this here. So what we can see here is that Lehman, the problem was that it bought a lot of mortgage securities when it shouldn't have. And in fact, it borrowed money to buy all these mortgage securities. And where it got the money to buy all these mortgages was from was from borrowing money on a short-term basis. The problem was that the short-term loans came due, and then it couldn't get new loans because everyone said, "Oh, Lehman owes too much money, and we don't know whether it's going to pay it back or not." So basically, the loans came due, the mortgages that it owned went bad, and now, well, basically, it was a deadbeat firm. It had no money to actually do what it said it was going to do, which was own these securities. So Lehman did make a lot of money during the housing bubble because it had bought so many of them, but it absolutely depended on real estate prices. Real estate prices rising, and in fact, when they didn't, then in 2007 and in 2008, that's when the problem starts to happen, which is kind of like the Japanese financial crisis, which we learned about 2 weeks ago. Okay, so what's important to kind of understand here too is that Lehman Brothers is just a single case, but it is an important case because it really does represent that bursting of the bubble. And when the housing prices peaked in 2006, other investment firms, the three other firms that survived, those firms actually did a pretty good job of raising more capital, like Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs raised money from Warren Buffett. Others did as well. But Lehman Brothers did not. Now, this was really the management problem. We don't know why they didn't do it. It could be a management mistake. It could be an oversight. It could have been optimism. It could have just been a bet that the housing correction wouldn't be that big and there would be no reason to raise more capital because things would get better. So maybe Lehman just ran out of time, right? Or maybe they thought they just ran out of time, and in fact they did. But again, the problem that Lehman Brothers failing, it was the fourth largest investment bank, which again, that's not the big deal, it failing. The big deal is that when it did fail, it failed spectacularly badly. So badly that Lehman Brothers failing, everyone else then said, well, why should we trust those other three? The other three investment banks. Why should we trust anyone? If Lehman can fail and the government's not going to do anything for it, then why should we trust them? So when there is no trust, the entire credit market freezes. No one lends money at all. No one lends anyone anything. That's the financial crisis. That's the liquidity crisis that made, when we talk about 2008, and we don't say the 2008 recession. We say the 2008 financial crisis. And the reason why it's a financial crisis is that second to last bullet point, because the credit markets froze. Let's just look at this here very quickly. This is a explanation or a little bit of a discovery of why from a managerial aspect, why they didn't do what they should have done. I know many of you might be business majors or have some interest in business. Let's just look at this management problem in the way that they failed to do what they should have done.
Prices spread to one of Wall Street's biggest and most respected firms.
Not since the Great Depression has the federal government stepped in to help a failing financial institution in this country the way they did over this past weekend.
Panic selling has brought Bear Stearns, an investment bank, to its knees. JP Morgan Chase buys the firm, but only after the government loans $30 billion to buy up Bear's most toxic assets.
So Bear Stearns gets bailed out. We're going to see this here. It gets bailed out in March of 2008. And it gets bailed out by the government. And the government basically allows it to be bought by someone else. And that the government will guarantee the debt of of Bear Stearns.
The Federal Reserve has moved quickly to bring order to the financial markets.
Now, when Bear Stearns fails, and we'll see this in the slides here, and even Bush might say this too, but Once this happens, everyone then says, okay, what's going to happen next? And everyone then says, okay, next weakest investment bank is going to fail. That would be Lehman Brothers.
Secretary Paulson is supportive of that action.
That's the Treasury
The
Secretary.
man at the center of it all, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, knows he has dodged a bullet.
After Bear Stearns, what did you think was going to happen? Did you think it was over?
Oh no. What hit us big time, all of us, was, wow, if an investment bank gets hit by a run in the middle of a panic, we don't have the authorities in the United States government to save them unless there's a buyer.
You hear that right there? He used the term run. That go back to the second slide in this thing here, right? That I said was the key point. It's the run on the investment bank that causes it to fail. Everyone saying Lehman is going to fail is what causes it to fail, right? The run on that bank, on that institution. And that's exactly what the Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson is saying. That as the government realizes after Bear Stearns that they don't have the authority to stop a run on an investment bank, unlike the power with the FDIC they have to stop a run on a depository bank, like, Bank of Hawaii or a bank like that.
Within hours of the rescue of Bear Stearns, all eyes turned to the next giant that might fall, Lehman Brothers. Lehman's books are loaded with troubled subprime mortgages.
I had 60 calls with Dick Fold from the time Bear Stearns went down until Lehman failed.
That guy right there, that's the was the head of Lehman Brothers. And so Hank Paulson is saying, dude, I called the guy 60 times telling him, raise more money, raise more capital, figure out a situation to avoid having a run. And what I'm saying here, and what I was saying here in the slide, was that guy right there, Dick Fold, the CEO of Lehman Brothers, did not take action to save the firm from March of 2008 to September of 2008. So it's like knowing, someone's gonna hurt you or you're going to get hurt, and then doing nothing to protect yourself. And that's essentially what they're saying here.
I said, what you should be doing is you should be raising capital and you should be looking for a cornerstone strategic investor or working to sell the business.
And what did he tell you?
Well, he's an optimist, so he basically said, I've got plenty of capital. We don't have significant risks.
But Lehman's falling stock price is telling a different story.
Financials took a big beating. Lehman down almost 20%.
In just a few months, Lehman has lost nearly half its value. Fold is enraged and blames those betting against his company, the short sellers.
I am soft, I'm lovable, but what I really want to do is I want to reach in, rip out their heart, and eat it before they die.
He would come up with these wacky ideas. He had this idea, Spinco, where he was going to put his bad assets in a pool and spin them off. And he would say, well, I want the government to guarantee it, or the government to put in capital. And we explained ad nauseum that the government couldn't do that.
Okay, so that gives you a little bit of an understanding of that critical management mistake that Lehman Brothers made. And it's essentially what is being said here. And the decision that Hank Paulson made, which he indicated in that video, was they were not going to bail it out. So and partly it's not, there's a way in which it's not Lehman Brothers' fault because the government was indecisive. They had obviously bailed out Bear Stearns, an investment bank, in March of 2008. Then when September came and Lehman Brothers was failing, the government said, nope, sorry, we don't bail out banks. And they're like, dude, you just bailed out Bear Stearns in March. What's going on? You changed your mind? And the government just said, dude, we don't bail out investment banks. That's not what we do. So they basically decided they were going to choose to let it fail. Let's understand what Lehman Brothers is. I'm just taking this from Wikipedia, but it gives you an idea of how the legacy, at least, of Lehman Brothers. It was an old investment bank. I mean, with roots back to American Express, which is pre-Civil War. And you get a lot of as a person that did spend a little bit of time in banking, like these are some pretty storied, some pretty reputable investment firms that all basically formed Shearson Lehman Brothers when the last Lehman died. So the last Lehman died in 1962, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So when the last Lehman dies, you then have to start merging with other firms, and Lehman Brothers, Kuhn Loeb, merges with Shearson, which was part of American Express, and then Shearson Lehman Brothers gets together with Neuberger Berman, and then becomes Lehman Brothers. And again, it wasn't. It's not that Lehman Brothers just just invested in the wrong thing. It also did some pretty fraudulent things. It basically engaged in creative accounting by repurchasing shares, but when it repurchases shares, it buys the share, temporarily takes it off its books, and then puts it into its books. But it recorded that repurchase of the shares as if someone else was buying it rather than them buying it. And obviously it held on to, it was not diversified in what it owned. It owned a lot of mortgages, and it owned a lot of subprime and low-rated mortgages. And right up until the point, so second fiscal quarter of 2008 ends in June, and they would report the results in September, and that's exactly what they did. In September, they report their second quarter results, and they report that they lost $2.8 billion, sold $6 billion in assets, and in that time, the stock fell by 73% from January 1st of 2008 to June 30th of 2008. I don't want to... You can watch this on your own. It's a pretty long video. You can just click through it.
Growing up as a female in Iran has its own limitations.
This is a pretty long discussion here, but this would be the creative accounting. So if you have an interest in accounting, I would encourage you to watch this video, but I don't want this to just be a super long video, lecture video. But this would be a 13-minute video about there was an investigation after Lehman Brothers failed of what fraud was conducted, and they basically found that fraud was conducted. And if you want to feel grumpy about the world, basically the government found that there was fraud, but no one was prosecuted. So the people that did bad stuff to cause Lehman Brothers to fail, were basically thieves and did the wrong thing, no one was prosecuted. And that would be this 13-minute video if you want to watch that. Okay. So Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy on September 15th. Now, there was accounting fraud, as I said before, but if you all have some interest in investment or in finance, read this. This is a transcript of the earnings call. So what happens is that when a company that has shares, like Lehman did, when a company has shares, it has to talk to investors 4 times a year, what's called a quarterly earnings conference call. And in that call, you're basically reporting the results from the quarter, and you're answering questions. So this one was done on September 10th. So September 10th, the firm had not declared bankruptcy yet. Obviously, was not being dissolved. It still was an existing firm. So they basically all get on the phone September 10th, and it's like the house is burning. The Lehman Brothers house is burning, and they're having a call and saying, dude, no, everything's fine here. Yeah, it's a little warm in here, but it's good. It was cold anyway. I mean, that's kind of what's going on here. Now, this is a really long PDF. But you might find it pretty interesting. So again, there's Dick Fuld. Bart McDade is another kind of actor in this whole thing here. But you could basically, I mean, again, you're seeing a lot of discussion of, yeah, things are bad, but, we're restructuring our commercial real estate. Things, yeah, we sold a lot of things. Things aren't fantastic, but it's going to be okay. And that's what you're seeing here. Right, basically right before the firm is going to fail, they're like, it'll be just fine. It'll all work out in the end. So if you want to read, I don't know if you're into that kind of thing, but basically, how a firm could, what it would look like as it's about to fail, that would be right here. And what led up to this as well, when we talk back about the managerial failure of the firm, there's another reason. It's not just Richard Fuld's fault, the CEO. He goes by the name Dick Fuld. So Dick Fuld, the problem as well was that most of the firm was owned by investment bankers with the firm. So employees of the firm, Lehman Brothers, owned the firm, a large number of the shares. And they basically were looking at a share price that was falling a lot. And they said, we've got to change the management. So they got rid of a lot of incredibly trusted people at the upper ranks of the management team. And they put in new people. And they were just kind of getting their feet wet. They were just trying to get into everything when this was already failing. And so it's not just the CEO's fault. As you can kind of see here, and you can all read, I'm not going to read this all to you here, but the names of the people here, the names aren't important, but what you see in these two bullet points here is you see people changing. You see big holes that need to be filled because you've got people basically getting fired or demoted, and then the replacement comes in and they're like still looking for where the bathroom is. They're still looking for their parking spot because they just got hired. And while they're like transitioning and doing all that stuff a new employee does, they're still trying to save the firm. Now, it came pretty close to being a different situation. And so the almost savior of Lehman Brothers was the Korea Development Bank, KDB. A very large bank, basically lots and lots of money. And they came over to New York, looked at Lehman Brothers and said, this might not be that bad. And they were obviously concerned about the mortgage securities, but they said, you know what, if the government's going to help us out like they did with the Bear Stearns thing, I think we could buy the good part of the bank and we would just spin off the other part. Now, there's a lot of debate about what actually happened in these negotiations, but the word on Wall Street is that Dick Fuld, the optimist, basically ruined the negotiations. That what he did is that Bart McDade, was one of the managers here that was talked about here, Bart McDade, who was the president and COO, chief operating officer. He was the one that was doing the negotiations with the Korea Development Bank. And he got pretty far with the Korea Development Bank to getting a final deal. And then at the last moment, right when the documents are going to be created and things are going to be signed, Dick Fuld comes to the meeting and basically blows it up. Blows it up in the sense he's like, hey, Korea Development Bank, why are you not buying this bad stuff, the mortgage securities? We actually think they're really good. You should buy everything, the good stuff and the bad stuff. Don't split up the company into two parts. Buy it all. And Korea Development Bank got very concerned about the fact that the management then of Lehman Brothers wasn't steady. Because you got one manager saying, yeah, we'll do this one thing. And then Bart McDade's colleague, basically the CEO, comes in and says, no, I'll do it this way. And so Korea Development Bank backs out. Once they back out and people talk, Korea Development Bank basically ensures that no one else is going to want to get, together with Lehman Brothers. And you basically are now getting to a point, or we're getting up to the point of the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, where Korea Development Bank backs out, and then the government says as well at that time, we're not going to help you this time. So now Lehman Brothers is like, okay, Korea Development Bank turned us down. Government turned us down. What are we going to do now? So the government, what it does, the Treasury Department, Hank Paulson, and the Federal Reserve, as represented by Tim Geithner, who's with the New York Federal Reserve Bank, they basically call up all the big banks in the United States. They get them all in a room together on a weekend, and they say, figure this out. This bank is going to fail. We are not, as the government, going to bail it out. Korea Development Bank's not going to help you out. You guys need to figure out what you're going to do. What is it going to look like? So one option, or an easy option, would be that you find one of those big banks that's in that room that just says, "Oh, dude, we'll buy Lehman Brothers. No worries. We'll take care of it." And they basically did. They had Bank of America. They actually had two people that were willing to buy Lehman Brothers, even after Korea Development Bank backed out and the government said no. That was Bank of America, B of A, and Barclays, which is a British bank. Then Bank of America looks into it more and more and more, and they're getting a little bit concerned. And then, what's not said in the book, but after Lehman... So when Bear Stearns failed, everyone said, okay, now Lehman's going to fail. Now when Lehman's going to fail, the next one they all think is going to fail is Merrill Lynch. So Merrill Lynch is one of the banks that's in this room. And Merrill Lynch is like, oh, fuck. Like, if Lehman fails, now everyone's going to come after us. We should approach Bank of America or Barclays and say, hey, there's this Lehman thing that you could buy, but why don't you buy us? Because we're going to be for sale too. So why don't you buy us instead of buying Lehman? Lehman's a piece of shit. Like, buy us. And that's exactly what happened. Bank of America was like, Lehman's okay, but we actually like this Merrill deal that we could do. And that's what they did. Bank of America ended up buying Merrill Lynch, which was one of the other investment banks. And so Lehman Brothers got really pissed because they were like, oh man, dude, that was the person that was going to buy us, Bank of America. Now we're stuck with Barclays, the British bank. Like, I guess, it'll be okay. Barclays will buy us. And then the British government, basically, which obviously regulates Barclays, the British bank, the British government tells Barclays, you can't buy it. We don't want you buying this really bad American company. So it couldn't happen. So the British basically ruined that part of the transaction. So now you get to a point where you don't know how organized this is all going to be. We know it's going to go bankrupt because no one's going to buy it. But the thing is do you know how you're going to clear all the trades and all the assets owned by this firm? And that's what I kind of outline here. So Monday morning, the market's open, obviously at 9:30 Eastern time. And you basically then at that point, you want to declare bankruptcy before it. You can't wait for the markets to open. You got to do it beforehand so that you can tell Wall Street, we've got a plan figured out about how this is all going to work out. So Lehman Brothers, 1 a.m. on Monday morning, says we're going to declare bankruptcy. And they say, this is our debt, $613 billion, that they have $155 billion in bond debt, and they only have assets of $639 billion. So obviously they don't have enough money. They say everything's going to still keep going as it does. Wall Street's going to provide the capital and make sure everything is kind of organized somewhat. And let's just look at this here really quick here. This is just a scene of what it looks like when everyone's leaving. So this is your kind of classic scene of employees, investment bankers that are basically fired because the firm they work for no longer exists. Okay, I'm not sure if I want to watch 2 minutes of people. Let's see here. I think when I watched this before, there's one guy that kind of is like giving an interview a little bit. This guy here, yeah, this British guy.
I don't know anything more than you. I've only been here a week, graduate scheme, and so my kind of career's been halted at the first hurdle, and that's it.
So it was this guy's first job. He was only there for a week, and they failed. So there's a bunch of investment bankers.
Well, that's not what we've been told in finance.
So anyway, these are a bunch of basically...
I think there are many possibilities, but there are a lot of people in Lehman fired today, a lot of people in Merrill Lynch probably fired in a couple of hours or days, I don't know.
So basically all these people are unemployed because the firm they work for is gone. Now, this is a pretty interesting thing here. So what could have made this bankruptcy more organized would have been had Warren Buffett intervened. So Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, was approached about basically guaranteeing all of Lehman Brothers' assets. That he could have put his name and his firm, Berkshire Hathaway, and could have backed Lehman Brothers' bankruptcy and said, if Lehman isn't good for something, we will cover it. So all these banks that got together in that room that day, Warren Buffett would not be part of that because he doesn't own a bank. They gave Warren Buffett a call, and they asked him to basically guarantee Lehman Brothers' failure, and obviously he would be compensated for it. But watch this incredibly interesting interview of Warren Buffett talking about it. We'll also watch Jane Goodall. I guess she's being a monkey or a chimpanzee.
This is me. This is Jane.
Oh, that's pretty interesting.
Merrill has found a lifeline, but Lehman is gasping for air.
What he's just saying there, Merrill found a lifeline. That was Merrill Lynch getting bought out by Bank of America, but now Lehman still has to be saved.
Late Saturday night, the CEOs back at the Fed agreed to cover Lehman's bad investments. That clears the way for Barclays to buy the bank.
By the time we left on Saturday, we had no reason to believe that we hadn't put forward a pretty viable solution for...
So this video here is basically saying, again, Bank of America is going to buy Merrill Lynch. They think, at least on that Saturday, before the Monday they actually go bankrupt, on that Saturday night, they think that Barclays is actually going to buy it.
Lehman, where Barclays would buy them, and we would all be part of some protection of the assets.
So the idea was that Barclays would buy Lehman Brothers, the good stuff, and that these other investment banks, like Vikram Pandit here, who owns Citi, they would basically create a big pool of money that would cover the bad stuff in Lehman Brothers, right? Because Barclays doesn't want to buy the bad stuff. Basically, they'll buy the good parts of Lehman Brothers. Barclays would buy the good parts of Lehman Brothers, and guys like Vikram here will buy the bad stuff in Lehman Brothers.
And that's how we went home.
Still to be worked out, who will come up with the billions needed to guarantee Lehman's trades until a Barclays shareholder vote?
So even if the deal goes through, Barclays has to approve the deal. The shareholders of Barclays have to approve the deal. But that's going to take weeks, if not months. So how do you keep Lehman Brothers going for those few months when the Barclays shareholders have to approve the deal?
Now, what would anyone do as a plan B? They'd call Warren Buffett.
Buffett is in Canada to attend a charity concert when Diamond reaches him on his cell phone.
And I said, how big a guarantee are you talking about? He said, unlimited. I said, well, that sounds a little unusual.
He was very thoughtful, listened carefully, said,
send me the details, tell me how much you'll pay, and whatever time I get back from this function, I'll get back to you.
Of course, we didn't have a fax machine in the bowels of the Fed. So what we did is we gathered the presentation, we called back his cell phone, and we left a very, very detailed voice message for him.
I came back up to the room, and there was no fax for me, and I called down to the hotel manager. I said, must be a mistake, because they're supposed to get fax for me. And he said, there's nothing here.
Do you know what happened to that voicemail?
I do now. I didn't at the time.
That was in September of 2008 or in July of 2009.
So listen to that. So July or September of 2008, they leave Warren Buffett a message, a voicemail, saying all the particulars of the deal that they want him to agree to. Warren Buffett gets back from the event that he had in Canada, from that evening, and he comes back to his room and he's like, where's the fax you guys were going to send me? And then he calls on the front desk and says, where's the fax? Did I get any faxes? And they're like, no, you didn't get any faxes, dude. And that's where we're at here.
I was coming out to Sun Valley.
He was driving with his daughter. His daughter told him that he had a voice message on his phone. And he said, I can't have a voice message on my phone. I don't even have voice message on this phone. And she said, yes, you do. And they played it. And it was us from the Fed.
So the message was received slightly late.
They didn't get it until June or July of 2009. So basically, they left him a message in September of 2008. And this old man doesn't know how to check his voicemail, or didn't know that he had a voicemail. And months and months later, after the economy is close to collapse, he realizes, what's this little letter envelope thing on my phone? Oh, I've got a voicemail? What's that? Yeah, so that's a problem.
So do you think things would have worked out differently?
No. It would have been an unlimited exposure that wouldn't have made sense. They had to figure out some way to limit it, and I really don't think the world would have changed it.
So he's saying it might not have changed history, but it's interesting to think of what could have been had Warren Buffett gotten that voicemail. That Lehman Brothers could have dissolved itself in a more organized fashion. Okay. So now where we are in the story here for chapter 13 is that Lehman Brothers does fail. And as we were saying, what the immediate thing we think of when something fails is what's going to fail next. And we were saying before that Merrill Lynch was going to fail, but now Merrill Lynch got bought out by Bank of America, so now it's all good. So now everyone's like, okay, Lehman Brothers fails. Now the next thing that's going to fail is this company called AIG. AIG is an insurance company, and AIG is different than Lehman Brothers primarily because it is really, 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 really big. Very big. Incredibly big. It's an incredibly large insurance company that insured the risk that Lehman Brothers doesn't fail. So when Lehman Brothers does fail, AIG is on the hook to pay out lots and lots of claims. More money than it has. So while Lehman made a mistake by buying all these bad mortgages, AIG made a mistake by buying lots and lots of insurance policies that Lehman Brothers would never fail. And those mortgages went bad, causing Lehman to fail. And then Lehman fails, and now it's going to threaten AIG failing. The government doesn't really have a choice at this point. They already can see how much Lehman Brothers failing has screwed up the market, and they can't let AIG fail. So now, only a few days after saying to Lehman Brothers, you have to fail, we don't bail out anyone, they then bail out AIG because it's really, really big. The federal government bails out AIG and spends $180 billion to buy shares in AIG and control it. At the same time, the federal government and Federal Reserve has to bail out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Those are the two big agencies that owned a lot of mortgages. So they have to put those into conservatorship, meaning they have to basically buy out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. As we know, the federal government gave a lot of money to General Motors, gave obviously the money to AIG, gave money to Citibank, Bank of America, 20 or 30 other institutions. I mean, that was kind of all the big banks that were all basically designed or designated to be too big to fail. And that then takes us, that pretty dense chapter then takes us to a point where then we move on from that, and in chapter 14 we try to understand then, well, what went on in 2008, and how is that like previous crises, and how would that be like future crises? And again, I'm assuming you can read here, so I'm not going to read each of these bullet points here, but in my summary of that chapter, basically the thing that we see is, again, there's a predictable model that financial crises follow, something that the authors point out throughout the book. But again, the most interesting thing is what I bolded here, is that again, in the past few decades, we've had waves of credit bubbles. The Latin American Mexico debt crisis, the Japanese crisis, East Asian financial crisis, and then the 2008 financial crisis. All of these crises are linked to each other. And they're linked to each other because what happens is that the crisis happens. We bail everybody out by providing lots of credit, and it actually gives the fuel to the next crisis. But what's also different here is that we obviously don't think that's going to change, because how we got out of the 2008 financial crisis is that we expanded a lot of credit. And even right now, with the crises that we're facing right now in the financial markets, we're bailing them out with lots of debt being issued and lots of credit. But the problem that causes is that you then have to choose. Because you're offering more debt, it then can reduce the value of your currency, which can cause other problems and can also affect how stable your entire financial system is. And that brings us then to the last chapter, chapter 15, where we then have to look at, like, from 2010 to the present, basically, and we have to see, could this happen again? And as the last bullet point points out here in bold, yeah, it's going to happen again. We know it's going to happen again. And we know it's going to happen again because with every financial crisis, we react in a way where we pass all these regulations. Obviously, with this one, we would have, with the 2008 financial crisis, we obviously did pass regulations to stop bad banking practices and whatnot, but the reforms do nothing to stop the next crisis. The seeds for the next crisis have already been planted, and those plants are already growing. Not to scare you here, but we already know that another thing will happen here. It is inevitable, and that's exactly what the last bullet point is, and it's exactly how this book concludes. Basically, if you don't learn the history of what went on here in this book, you will absolutely repeat it. And the next time that there is a crisis in the U.S. economy or in the world economy, I'd like you to try to at least remember some things from this class, or at least that you have the book and you would look at this book again, maybe, because you absolutely will see it happening again, and it will follow this model. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the book at this point. So now you have enough information to certainly do the midterm. which covers this book, and then that covers the most substantial reading you're going to have to do for this course. Now we're going to basically look at two very large financial crises, the one being the Great Depression, and then the other one we're going to look a little bit deeper at the 2008 financial crisis.